What sounds like fiction but is actually a real historical event. 4 Auschwitz prisoners stole Nazi uniforms, and a car. Only one of them was speaking German, so he was wearing the highest rank uniform. When they left the camp they've encountered 2 patrols. First patrol, with some high-ranked guy, just hailed to them. Second patrol with 2 low-rank soldiers told them they can't leave because orders etc. Guy speaking German started screaming at them so loud and so realistically they just said we're sorry, go ahead. Edit, U/Aviation Atom found a documentary/movie about this. Thanks again buddy. You're an absolute unit. Hope people'll stop asking for it in comments. During World War I the German Navy built a ship and painted it to make it look like a British ship called the RMS Carmania in order to infiltrate and destroy British convoys. On the ship's first outing, the first enemy it encountered was the real RMS Carmania, which promptly sunk it. In 2007 a paraglider got trapped in the updraft of 2 joining thunderstorms and was lifted to an altitude of 33,000 feet. She landed over 3 hours later about 60 kilometers north of her starting position, having survived extreme cold, lightning and lack of oxygen. Jeanne de Clisson, 1300 to 1359, was married to a French nobleman who was beheaded for treason by the French king. Enraged, she sold their estate and purchased 3 black warships with red sails, and became a pirate queen of the English Channel who targeted French ships. She became known as the Lioness of Brittany, and in her 13 years of piracy she would slaughter every member of a ship's crew except for one so that last survivor could go back and tell the French king what had happened. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919, a tank filled with 2 gallons of molasses burst and sent a tidal wave of molasses through the streets of Boston. 21 people were killed. I was listening to a podcast about this once, and a little boy watched his mom and his brother drown in the molasses while he tried to surf over to them on a bed that was floating, but he couldn't get over to them fast enough. Fuck. Also, the people in the town would constantly complain about the tank because they saw it was leaking and might explode. They responded by just painting the tank brown so people wouldn't see it leaking. Apparently if you go to this spot in Boston in the summer, you can still faintly smell the molasses. Edit, I will retract the last statement. I've gotten plenty of messages saying that's an urban legend. Apparently that area just smells like butts. Timothy Dexter was frequently given terrible business advice that would somehow through a stroke of luck pay off. He sold coal to Newcastle and made a profit. He became insanely wealthy, dressed in a strange manner, and acted weird in the company of the incredibly wealthy elite he had accidentally stumbled into. He spent a lot of time basically gaslighting his own wife for his own amusement. For quite some time he acted as if she had died and was a ghost, even introducing her to other people as his wife's ghost. He at one point even faked his own death so he could see how people would react at his funeral. He also wrote a book that was a long-winded rant about everything that upset him. The book included no punctuation. He made a second edition with several pages of punctuation attached to the end that the reader could distribute as they saw fit. Basically a real-life shitpost. The escape from Antarctica by the members of the Antarctic expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. The stuff they went through was unbelievable. Their boat, the Endurance, was crushed by ice floes. They were stranded on the floes for over a year in temperatures well below freezing. They then took to 3 boats around 22 feet in length across the Antarctic Ocean looking for land. There were about 10 men in each boat. They missed reaching land by just a few miles at times. 2/3 of them got stranded on Elephant Island surrounded by ice while one of the boats went out in search of rescue. That boat made it through the Drake Passage, one of the deadliest places in the ocean. All but 3 of them got stranded with little food and water, while the 3 men who left became the first people to cross South Georgia on foot. They found civilization, rescued the men who came through the Drake Passage, waited months until they could rescue those on Elephant Island. Every single person who came on the initial voyage survived, with the worst lasting consequence being a single foot amputation. An English king named Ethelred, later called the Unready, took some troops to defend against a Viking invasion. The weather was bad, so a lot of the Vikings' ships crashed as they were landing. Ethelred thought that it would be dishonorable to attack them as they were stumbling onto shore, so he kept his troops back until the Vikings had a chance to get together and form proper battle lines before he attacked them. The better prepared Vikings then won the fight and slaughtered a bunch of Ethelred's men, and he and the rest were forced to run away while the Vikings went around pillaging. Mad Jack Churchill, the man with the only confirmed longbow kill in World War II. Guy and his squad did a death march towards the Germans while playing bagpipes, got captured and sent to a concentration camp. He then escaped, got caught again, and then escaped a different concentration camp. Also, he always carried a Scottish longsword with him. There's so much other weird shit he did after the war, and it's amazing to me that he's entirely real. The CIA was researching psychic abilities for 30 years as a way to spy on the USSR. After 30 years, the program was terminated, and their conclusion was that psychic powers probably don't exist. Edit: the actual conclusion was that the evidence for remote viewing was unfalsifiable, and therefore unprovable. Many of the more promising results were believed to be caused by information leakage, meaning that test subjects had prior knowledge about the subject they were asked about. They were unable to verify any of their results because of this, and even if the psychic abilities were real, they were unreliable at best. Edit 2, the codename for the project was Stargate. You can find the documents on the CIA website here. The life of Harriet Tubman, one of the rare examples of someone who is a household name for being a badass who was actually about 10 times more badass than people know about. Things she did other than the Underground Railroad. 1. She financed and recruited for John Brown's Harper's Ferry slave revolt raid, and the only reason she didn't fight in person was she was bedridden with malaria. 2. During the Civil War, she joined the Union Army as a cook/nurse. 3. She somehow class shifted into a spy/scout and helped Union leaders plan raids into Confederate territory, and she assassinated several Confederates. 4. She rose in the ranks until she commanded a small raiding force of 300 Union troops from the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment, the second black U.S. Army unit ever. 5. Her command, Company C, 54th, raided southern plantations, slaughtered slave drivers, and freed captive slaves. 6. In the Combahee Ferry raid, where the 54th freed 700 slaves, she was also in command of 3 Union frigates, and when a Confederate division was advancing on them, she fired broadsides from the 3 naval warships directly into the enemy troops. 7. She survived the war, and immediately turned around and started fighting for women's suffrage. Not exactly historical, but a poodle named Kashi, in Caballito, Buenos Aires, fell from 13 floors and fatally hit 75-year-old Martu Espinar, killing both instantly. In the course of the events, 46-year-old Edith Sola, who came to see the incident, was fatally hit by a buzz. An unidentified man, who witnessed Edith's death, had an heart attack and also died, on his way to the hospital. Spartan weddings. Basically, young Spartans were trained for years in camps, surrounded only by men. So, when the time came for marriage, the women would shave their heads and dress in men's clothing, since the idea of having sex with anyone other than a man weirded out the grooms. Sgt Stubby. During World War I, a soldier found a stray dog when training on the Yale University campus, and took a liking to him. The soldier snuck the dog onto the ship when he had to leave campus, and when the dog was found by the commanding officer, he was allowed to stay because he had learned how to salute. Stubby was injured a few times during the war, but he was useful with alerting his squad of surprise mustard gas attacks and gunshots before the human ear could detect the sound. He also found and comforted wounded soldiers and caught a German soldier by the leg of his pants until American soldiers got to him. AKA the bestest boy to ever live. Joshua Norton was just this random crazy guy from San Francisco who hated all this political nonsense that was going on at the time and figured he could do the job better at it himself, and thus the Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico was born. While he held no real power, the people liked him so much that they treated him like royalty anyways. Any currency issued under his name was treated like real money at many establishments. One day, he was arrested by a private security force because of his mental health, which enraged practically all of San Francisco. The police chief let him go because he had committed no crime, and Norton gave an imperial pardon to the guy who arrested him. After this incident, any police officer Norton passed would salute him. Another time, when a riot had formed and was getting pretty violent, Norton simply stood in front of the mob and calmly prayed, which managed to disperse the mob. And that's not even a fraction of the crazy stuff that he did. The Battle of Samar, October 25, 1944. Taffy 3, a group of around a dozen small American escort carriers, destroyers, and escort destroyers, found themselves under attack by the Center Force, around 24 of the most powerful warships in the Japanese Navy including battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Thanks to the incredible bravery and determination of every ship involved, and incompetence on the part of the Japanese forces, they inflicted heavy casualties on the vastly superior force and got them to retreat. Some highlights include the destroyer Johnston scoring first blood by blowing the bow off the cruiser Kumano with torpedoes, charging the largest battleship ever built, Yamato, and forcing her to retreat with more torpedoes, though this may have actually been the destroyer hull's doing, shooting up the battleship Haruna and the cruiser Tone and driving off an entire destroyer squadron by herself. All this time the Johnston was under near constant fire, tanking several battleship-grade shells as repair crews were furiously working to keep the ship operational. In her last moments fighting she was exchanging fire with up to 4 cruisers and several destroyers. The Johnston fought so valiantly and caused so much damage the Japanese thought she was a cruiser, and when she was finally sunk, the captain of the destroyer Yukikaze was seen saluting her as she went under. The destroyer Heermann exchanging broadsides with the battleship Nagato and cruisers Haguro and Tone, and later assisting destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts in her pummeling of the cruiser Chikuma. Heermann would be the only destroyer of Taffy 3 to survive the battle. The destroyer hull firing lances of torpedoes that temporarily takes battleship Yamato and possibly the cruiser Haruna out of the fight for some amount of time, and exchanging fire with an unknown Tone-class cruiser. Unfortunately Hull didn't share the good fortune of the rest of the destroyers, and was sunk early in the battle. The escort destroyer Samuel B. Roberts charging the Japanese force alongside the destroyers of Taffy 3, despite being significantly slower and weaker, striking the cruiser Chokai with at least 1 torpedo. However, she is most known for firing her entire ammunition supply into the cruiser Chikuma, severely damaging her stern and mauling the ship's superstructure as well as setting her bridge on fire, actions that would earn her the nickname the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Chikuma would later be scuttled, partially as a result of the damage Samuel B. Roberts dished out. However, the destroyer escort herself would not survive the battle, the only ship of her class sunk at Samar. The escort carrier White Plains severely damaging the cruiser Chokai with her sole 5-inch gun, triggering a massive chain of explosions that would force her to retreat and later be sunk by aircraft. White Plains also took a very close near miss from one of Yamato's shells early in the battle that crippled her superstructure and put her out of action for several minutes, so much so that the Japanese ships assumed she would sink, but good damage control meant she recovered quickly and would survive the battle. All in all, 3 Japanese cruisers were sunk and 3 more were severely damaged, along with 1 damaged destroyer and every battleship except Yamato having taken damage as well. The US lost 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort, with most other ships taking damage as well. There is absolutely no logical reason the US forces shouldn't have been completely curb-stomped here. Things couldn't have been weighed more heavily in Japan's favor. But somehow, Taffy 3 pulled off a miracle. That's a pretty basic summary of things. Trackiniffle has a great video on the battle which can be seen here. Apparently, death from laughter is an incredibly rare but a completely legit cause of death. In the 3rd century BCE, Chrysippus, a Greek Stoic philosopher, died of laughter after he saw a donkey eating his figs. And Chrysippus is not the only isolated case. Among the few other cases, a 5th century BCE Greek painter, Zeuxis, is said to have died laughing at his painting of the goddess Aphrodite, for which an old woman, who had commissioned the painting, had insisted on modeling. Also, Cleopatra, the ruler of Egypt in the 1st century BCE, claimed that her retainer died laughing at her husband's death. According to the linked Wikipedia article, the most recent case is that of Ole Bentsen, a Danish audiologist, who saw a funny scene in a comedy film and laughed so hard that his heart rate rose to a point where he had a fatal heart attack, in 1989. From what I understood from reading up on this topic, it's not the act of laughing itself but rather a fatal repercussion from a fit of laughter, such as cardiac arrest, asphyxiation or aneurysm, which causes death. For instance, Ole Bentsen suffered a heart attack as a consequence of the terrible fit of laughter he had. It's possible that such was the case of Chrysippus, and others, as well. I always thought of "I'm gonna die laughing" as a hyperbole, and I myself use it quite liberally. But I guess every hyperbole has a grain of truth to it. In the Middle Ages, gays and lesbians would become nuns and monks to avoid persecution, and since religion was a heavy influence in those days, it was seen as noble that they were dedicating themselves to God. They would have special friends, and since no one could get pregnant, it wasn't that big of an issue. In 1971, a teenage girl named Julian Koepke was on a plane that was struck by lightning and disintegrated in the air. She plummeted 3,000 meters strapped to her seat, and landed in the Amazon rainforest. Her mom had been on the flight with her, and Julian searched in vain for her mom, but Julian was the sole survivor of the crash. She survived 11 days alone, treating her maggot-infested wounds with fuel and using tracking techniques her father had taught her, before she found a boat that she used to make her way back to civilization. What an absolute legend. The death of Ken Rex McElroy. He terrorized Skidmore, Missouri for decades. Stalking, assaulting, murdering and raped two 14-year-olds who were his wives. He had an expensive attorney, so he was never charged. The law never helped the poor town. One day, the town gathered for a meeting on how to deal with McElroy. Details get a little vague here, but apparently someone alerted the room that McElroy was in the bar up the street. Quietly and calmly, everyone got up and walked over to the bar. As McElroy got into his truck, someone shot him in the back of the head. The town just went back to their business. When the witnesses, like the entire town, were questioned, everyone claimed they didn't see anything. No one has ever been arrested. Start of World War I. Doomsday cult assassination gone wrong until the driver takes a wrong turn, allowing it to go right again. Sets of armed conflict between two countries, but those two countries have allies, and those allies have allies. And soon Europe is engulfed in war with countries from around the world participating in what was called at the time, the Great War, or the war to end all wars. But in reality it was only an appetizer to the all-out destruction and human brutality of World War II. That's the popular story, but in reality the war didn't start just because of the assassination. In fact, after the assassination, the Austro-Hungarian government sent a list of demands to Serbia. Serbia actually accepted all but one of those demands. When the news was sent to the German Kaiser, he is said to have scribbled in the margin, "A great moral victory for Austria," no doubt, but with it goes any moral justification for the war. The truth is, the European nations went to war because they wanted to, and had been wanting to for a while. In Germany's case, they wanted to fight Russia. This was because of a railway system Russia was building. We can see in some German military communique from quite a while before the whole Bosnia-Herzegovina issue, some of the top brass were worried about the Russian railway system, that would be complete by 1920, and were expressing fear that once it did, they would be unable to match the sheer amount of manpower Russia could send to the front. If they had to have a war with Russia, it would have to be before that, and they must never recover from it. In France's case, they wanted to recover the provinces of Alsace and Lotharingen that Prussia had seized from them in the previous century, to hopefully carve out a separate state in their traditional allies in South Germany out of the German Empire. For Britain, it was about the navy and the economy. Germany had gotten into a naval arms race with Britain for a while, and Britain's solution to that was to build 2 warships for every one that Germany commissioned. However, as the new German nation started getting more and more industrialized and economically powerful, they were able to build a lot more ships, and Britain worried that continuing that system would put too heavy a strain on their economy. This, along with Germany's new colonial ambitions, made them keen to cut Germany down to size. So even if the Archduke's assassination hadn't gone the way it had, or had not even happened at all, there still would have been a war. The Tamam Shud case. Shortly after World War II, a well-groomed, athletic man was found dead on an Australian beach. There's no apparent cause of death. It is impossible to identify the man. Some mysterious clues are found. Among them, a book with a cryptic message written into it. Later, they bury his corpse compassionately. Even later, it turns out that he might have been searching for a child he possibly fathered some years ago. And that the mother possibly had been a spy, who had fallen in love with a spy from abroad, the unidentified man, who might have fathered said child with her, back then. As he realized that the mother wouldn't be meeting him anymore, he would have poisoned himself on the beach. And since he was a spy, he used a poison that doesn't leave a trace. The entire life of Julie d'Aubigny. Bisexual swordmaster, heartthrob turned opera singer who lived her life entirely for the lols. Beat the shit out of dudes in sword duels, and doing it topless whenever anyone doubted she was a lady. Got in trouble for making out with ladies at royal balls. Once became a nun to fuck a nun and then set fire to the convent. Shit is so wild, it's insane there's not a blockbuster movie about her. The Bone Wars. 2 rival paleontologists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, were in a race for academic clout, so they both took off to places like the fossil beds of Montana and Utah to try and dig up as many dinosaurs as possible before the other guy. But they didn't stop there, and hired spies and saboteurs to impede the other's work, as well as trying to pass off sloppy or fake skeletons sometimes. The overwhelming majority of iconic dinosaur genre that we know were either first discovered or simply got a lot of new samples to work with, and were made iconic by the amount of publicity they received. This includes Triceratops, Stegosaurus, some remains of Tyrannosaurus, Apatosaurus, and many, many more. This is also where the Brontosaurus confusion comes from. One of the scientists, I forget who, had already discovered Apatosaurus. The other then discovered a new skeleton of the same dinosaur, but intentionally put a skull from a different species, Camarasaurus, onto that skeleton and tried to pass it off as a new species entirely, Brontosaurus. The fake was unveiled pretty quickly but the name stuck. More recently, however, we have a lot more tools to distinguish smaller features from bones, and it was found that the skeleton that was originally passed off as Brontosaurus is actually barely different enough to receive its own genus, and the name Brontosaurus was revived. I've always thought that this could make a fantastic show, especially if it includes dramatized flashbacks to how the dinosaurs in the skeletons died. Edit, the Wikipedia page's intro describes it very nicely as well. The Bone Wars, also known as the Great Dinosaur Rush, was a period of intense and ruthlessly competitive fossil hunting and discovery during the Gilded Age of American history, marked by a heated rivalry between Edward Drinker Cope, of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia, and Othniel Charles Marsh, of the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale. Each of the two paleontologists used underhanded methods to try to outdo the other in the field, resorting to bribery, theft, and the destruction of bones. Each scientist also sought to ruin his rival's reputation and cut off his funding, using attacks in scientific publications. Edit: It's worth noting that the Bone Wars have had a massive positive legacy on paleontology as a field, but left both scientists financially and socially ruined. An excellent bittersweet ending.